players we might be completely wrong on, and then also a super flex best ball draft. That's what we're going to be doing today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz, including a recently released list of his priority targets. This is something we've talked about on the stream on the show before, that last year you expanded this idea of like targets and fades and stuff. Like in my rankings last year, I had targets and fades, and I loved the way you expanded it. I remember talking about it, and you guys, you in your rankings last year did it, and you now have released for summer best balls drafts, a list of rankings that also does it, where you have not just target and fade, but you have priority targets, you have normal targets, you have a moniker for when that player falls, which I love. Something like people have asked for that kind of stuff from us before. Like, we can talk about all of our targets, but what about the players that you would draft if they're behind ADP? And then the other players that you wouldn't draft, even if they are behind ADP, you're completely kind of off them. And those are two different categories, even though we don't spend a lot of time talking about those players. We want to talk about some of those types of players on today's show, not just the same stuff that we always talk about. But yeah, make sure you go check out Shawn's rankings and those key labels. He also has occasional, in emergency, and then he has a category for a specific action. You have some specific scenarios where you'll draft certain guys. So, I mean, he has his rankings out, and then he has a column that tells you all the different ways to play all the different players. When there's certain stacks, then you can take certain players. When a player falls and you need a certain type of thing, like for a specific running back, when he falls and you need an RB1 at that point, he's a good start to a later build, a later running back build. When this player falls and you have a piece from the other side of his week 17 correlation, then okay, you can take that player, all of those things. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about that for a second because I think it's really cool. And I think it's a really clever way to think through rankings, because I'm like at my newsletter and in other places, Shawn, just constantly like, everyone wants rankings, but rankings are like the worst thing you can give people, because there needs to be context like this about how to use them in actuality. So those are awesome. Make sure you're signed up, subscribe to RotoViz, and make sure you read those. For today's show, for everyone who's been listening for a while, we've done a lot of shorts, and then we've had a longer episode. And we tend to pick our day of the week, Shawn, that we're going to record, and just record for a really long time because we like to chat. You and I just spent over an hour and a half chatting before we even hit record. And believe it or not, my thought today was that we would maybe try to jump right into a recording and get as much of that on the recording as possible. It's usually my fault that we chat for as long as we do. But I had thought in my head, we'll be efficient today. And, an hour and a half of pre-recording chatting maybe isn't the most inefficient we've been, but it's certainly not efficient. But today we're going to do a couple of different concepts in our long recording that are going to be broken up into shorts. But if you're listening to the long recording, you're going to hear us kind of probably transition halfway through. We're going to talk through some players that we might be really wrong on, some players that we have some preconceived notions on, or some ideas of how things might go for them in 2024, which obviously it's still early June. We're not completely set in stone with any of the things that we're believing necessarily, but there are some things that as we start to develop these rankings and these opinions, and you're a little further ahead than me on that process, in terms of, identifying targets and things like that. I haven't necessarily gotten all of my ducks in a row on that. I still want to get through my full projections that I like to do every year before I release my first rankings. But there's a lot of things that I've argued over the last few weeks and months. And regardless, we have a lot of stances between the two of us. And there are then, as we're drafting, situations where we have to question those stances, and we might be open to the idea of being completely wrong in our initial thought, right? And so we wanted to talk about some of those types of players today. We also wanted to talk about some of the fun new contests out there. Underdog has released a lot of different best ball contests that have been I've had a blast with them. I just got back from a quick trip out of state so I could do some of them. I like a lot of the different formats. I've written up a strategy guide for the Eliminator over at the Stealing Signals newsletter. But they just released the puppy for Superflex drafts, and that's the one that really caught my eye. I love the idea of Superflex Best Ball, which I know you do a lot of with Colin Kelly over at RotoViz Overtime, Sean. But we will do one of those at the end of today's show as well. But yeah, a couple different topics on the docket. How you doing?
Good. And I did want to point out, I appreciate you mentioning the priority targets list and sort of strategy guide. Right after we recorded last week, you released the perfect storm candidates for monster 2024 seasons. I can't imagine a title that would possibly get people more fired up. If you have missed on subscribing to Stealing Signals so far, obviously you're going to want to get over there and get that. Ben, the reason that this topic kind of popped into my head as a possibility for us today was that when Pete and I were drafting on the Best Ball Banana Stand on Monday, we ended up with some Vikings, some Seahawks. We were looking at a 3 QB build with Caleb Williams having been the lone QB that we got early. And we kind of tail end of that draft. We take both JJ McCarthy and Geno Smith. And both of those guys make me feel uncomfortable. And so then you have to question to an extent like how you can be so high on some of the other ones. I know that when we were drafting recently, I kind of wanted to pass on Justin Jefferson for Amon-Ra St. Brown. And you're like, you want to pass on the best wide receiver in the NFL for a guy who has as much target competition as Amon-Ra, and that makes sense to me. I do think that Jordan Addison is very interesting as an easier and less risky way to play the idea that the Vikings pass offense isn't a train wreck. And so I'm kind of trying to balance those two things in my head. But as we go kind of beyond that and we're thinking about, well, how do we get that third QB if we're set up with this nice Seattle play? Like, am I comfortable taking Geno Smith at all? And that was sort of the first time that I had taken him. And part of my thesis on that, or part of my concern on that, is that I do think that he has a chance to lose that job, either because Sam Howell is so good in the preseason or because Geno is so mediocre during the season that their incentive as an organization is simply to see what they have with the backup QB and kind of point toward 2025. This Seattle team doesn't, on the surface, seem like a competitor in this division that has the 49ers, that has probably a resurgent Los Angeles Rams team. They were looking like one of the best teams in the NFL at the end of last year, and then could get a big jump from the Arizona Cardinals with a healthy Kyler and this addition of Marvin Harrison to go with the breakout we got last year from Trey McBride. And yet one of the things that continually jumps out to me is that I do want pieces of this Seattle offense, in part because I think both running backs are undervalued, in part because I'm really excited about your Washington Huskies offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, and what he could potentially do with the Seahawks, and in part because they have 3 potentially elite wide receivers. So one of the other little things that I was kind of looking at here, and this is potentially a misleading way to look at it, but the teams that have 3 wide receivers in the first 10 rounds are the Chiefs, the Texans, the Bears, the Seahawks, the Packers, and the Bills, right? The teams that would go to 4, if you include tight end, include still just the Chiefs and the Bills. The teams that would go to 3, if you include tight end, are the Lions, 49ers, and Jaguars. So you do have some other situations there where quarterbacks are maybe not that expensive. Those teams with the tight end included. Jared Goff, not that expensive. Brock Purdy, not that expensive. Trevor Lawrence, not that expensive after disappointing last season. But when you look at that first group, I mean, you're talking about Patrick Mahomes going to go early, CJ Stroud early, Caleb Williams, that sort of risk reward type of pick as a rookie who's surrounded with great talent and, potentially has some rushing value. In my profile of him in the Rookie 101 series, I kind of go into some more depth about what his rushing profile will probably look like. The Packers, obviously Jordan Love going early, and then the Bills, sort of a weird one there. And I'm actually interested in a couple of the Bills guys too, as we sort of navigate our way through this conversation. Sort of the Bills players in terms of the receivers, not obviously Josh Allen. But when you look at that group, I mean, Geno Smith is the guy that you can draft at the very end. And I mean, his guys are not like the Bills, where the Bills, saying that they have 3 guys in 10, they're barely in 10. They don't have any guys early. But with the Seahawks, I mean, you're talking about DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. And while you have a lot of discussion about JSN either as a breakout candidate or someone who's vastly overvalued because he wasn't that great last year, and you're behind 2 stars in a poor passing offense, the fact remains that, I mean, you have Tyler Lockett going really late in drafts, in part because of the other 2 guys, and in part because there is a lack of confidence in Geno. My question, or my sort of starting point for this discussion, is what do we make of Tyler Lockett being where he is, and what do we make about Geno Smith coming off of a bad 2023, but having played well? And even though, this is obviously not the important way to look at what a quarterback has done, led the NFL in completion percentage in 2022. That was one of the things that Grubb mentioned recently. If you Google either one of those guys, you're going to come up with an article talking about how Geno is the perfect fit for Grubb's offense. That's, off-season puff piece, coach speak, nirvana, basically.
101. Yeah.
Right, 101. But there are intriguing elements to this that if we're off Geno Smith, we're going to miss Tyler Lockett. Maybe we miss DK Metcalf, but we're also going to miss a really cheap way to get a lot of QB points to round out drafts.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. The QB side of it that we talked briefly as we were talking about our ideas for today about this Geno Smith conversation, and you talked about that, and I was thinking about him as I mentioned. I had taken him a couple times, and that was an intriguing concept because I had basically done the same thing where I was like, yeah, I mean, I don't really feel good about the 17 games, but in this particular build, I want to take him. But I had been thinking about him as a stack candidate. I know one time I took him, I had gone JSN and Lockett in the build, and it was like, well, now I kind of have to take Geno. I'm betting on, but I guess that's not true. I didn't have to take him because I think you can make a directional bet on the wide receivers and the overall passing volume for the Seahawks and still say like, well, Geno plays 10 games and Howell plays 7, but it combines for 600 pass attempts, and you have, a lot of really good stuff. The Ryan Grubb effect is there, and there's a lot of, passing and so I guess I didn't have to take Geno, but it was trending towards a late round quarterback build, and it was like, well, I have a double stack here, and Geno makes a lot of sense, and so I took him. And as you were describing that, I was thinking it through the lens of a stack, and I'm building out, a Seattle scenario. And interestingly enough, I know you were talking about the Bears in the context of another team that has 3 wide receivers going in the top 100 picks, but they are the week 17 matchup. And I'm taking some Keenan Allen and some Rome Odunze and even some, Cole Kmet if I haven't gotten into 2 early tight ends, which I typically am. But Kmet's kind of my fallback tight end 2 when I don't get one earlier. And so Seattle has a matchup, and I like the Bears running backs as well at their prices. We can talk about them sometime, but they have a matchup in week 17 that when you start to build these, these underdog teams and you're really worried about that week 17, it's convenient. It's convenient to build through Seattle and Chicago and that game for week 17 and that correlation. If you do get yourself into a late round quarterback build, I've found myself thinking about Geno a lot. And like I said, have pulled the trigger a couple of times, but I like the way that you frame that from the perspective of maybe he's the cheapest way play that particular concept of teams that have. I remember JJ Zachariason talking about that a little bit last year, and we've talked about it before on the show. This concept of 3 really high end receiving options in terms of high end, in terms of ADP. When drafters are this confident in 3 pass catchers in an offense, what that says about the quarterback's potential and the offense's passing game potential. And with the addition of Ryan Grubb, what if Seattle becomes a fun offense because of the way that the Huskies, my Washington Huskies in college last year played? You can certainly make the case that an aggressive pass first offense is possible this year. And if they're doing these puff pieces about Geno, it might not even be so much about the stacks and everything. It might be that, hey, Geno Smith is just a really key late round quarterback way to play this. In terms of the question about Lockett and what to make of him, we've talked a little bit about that group of veterans, and I think I've expanded it more than the ones that you're maybe in love with. You did mention the Bills guys. I'm curious if you're including Curtis Samuel in that, but there's this group of 4 veterans that to me are really interesting in 2024 drafts. It's Cortland Sutton, Curtis Samuel, Tyler Lockett, and Mike Williams. They all go between pick 95 and 108 at Underdog right now. They are back to back to back to back in their current ADP. Beyond them is Romeo Doubs, who I think has some real question marks about talent after 2 tough seasons in terms of like yards per out run and some of that stuff. I really liked him as a prospect. Hope he, turns out to be great, but has some real question marks. And because of the talent question marks, a lot of people are really into Dontavian Wicks, maybe taking his role in 3 receiver sets at some point this year, alongside Christian Watson and Jaden Reed. So you have some question marks about playing time. Khalil Shakir is the next guy. I've heard a lot about how efficient he was, but very limited role, actually, when you really dig into Khalil Shakir and what he's actually done. And yes, I understand that the Bills are wide open. But yeah, he has 65 targets through 2 seasons, through 31 games. I mean, he's averaging about 2 targets per game. Hasn't played a lot. Some of that's routes run stuff. The efficiency, I saw Denny Carter tweet out that his success rate, I think, maybe led the NFL last year. So some stuff in Shakir's profile that's good. His yards per target's very strong. But you'd like to see the target earning more than just the success rate once the target comes, or the efficiency once the target comes. Rashid Shaheed, another, explosive but limited volume play, and on and on. That to me is outside the wide receiver window pretty clearly. Those are now getting into different profiles where we're like, okay, well, there's spike week potential and this and that. But when we talk about the wide receiver window ending around this point every year, we're talking about upside wide receiver profiles, guys that could make the climb, as you've explained in the past, to where they could be drafted in round 2 next year or something like that. The Romeo Doubs, Khalil Shakir, Rashid Shaheed group, probably outside that, probably more role-playing wide receivers, at least in the ways that I'm looking at them. In front of those 4 veterans, Sutton, Samuel, etc., the 3 receivers right in front of them are Christian Watson, Rashee Rice, who's, obviously fallen for off-field stuff, but has upside. Jameson Williams, an upside profile, hasn't really played a ton, but I think those are much easier to make the case are traditional upside profiles. Christian Watson was going a lot higher last year. Rashee Rice was going at the 2-3 turn last year. I think that's part of why Rashee Rice's fall ended here, because it's like the back of the wide receiver window. JSN is going a few slots ahead of that. Deontay Johnson, who we know has a different type of upside, a pure volume upside, but has the potential to rack up 160 targets and really matter from pick 80 if he just racks up that much volume. That's, I think, pretty clearly inside the wide receiver window. Maybe you disagree on 1 or 2 names. So the group of 4 veterans to me is so interesting: Sutton, Samuel, Lockett, and Williams, in that I think in the past, this particular type of veteran that we know is probably going to run a ton of rolls, you can, or ton of run routes, you can maybe pull Mike Williams out of this for health reasons, and maybe even Curtis Samuel out of it because of Buffalo being maybe more rotational. But Sutton and Lockett, I think for sure, we know are going to be really locked into roles and run a lot of routes in those offenses. I think probably Samuel and Williams are similar. And those types of guys, because they end up projecting, we always talk about how projections end up influencing this stuff, they wind up going in like round 7 most seasons. And then some of the back end upside profiles like Jameson Williams wind up being that, is he in or out of the wide receiver window player? But because over a longer timeline, we're clearly moving toward younger players being drafted higher, more buy-in from upside, especially over at Underdog as a site. I mean, up ahead of JSN and those guys, you have Brian Thomas, you have Keon Coleman, you have Lad McConkey. Those guys are all comfortably inside the wide receiver window. Um, there's like 6 or 7 rookie receivers going in the top like 75-ish picks this year. And Marvin Harrison's going at like pick 14 right now. Like there's a lot more buy-in in the younger players. We saw that with the running back dead zone, how the more exciting younger profiles started to creep up when it was clear that like those are the one profile that you can target in the dead zone. And it's changed the texture of the running back dead zone over the last 3 or 4 years. We're not seeing it so much at tight end quite yet. We didn't, Laporta was a late round hit, and people are still willing to kind of wait around on Brock Bowers, who you want to draft in every draft, Sean. But I think over a longer timeline, you've played fantasy for 10, 20 years. For those of you who have, you've seen this happen. We're shifting towards the younger players. And as a result, some of the boring profiles fall back. And I mentioned the dead zone. Those dead zone running backs fall back. I saw a tweet the other day. I can't remember from who. Maybe it was from Ian Harditz, I believe, that was mentioning there's like 5 or 6 teams that don't have a running back in the top 100 picks or something like that, which it used to be that the dead zone was those back end number ones that are being projected for volume. But those guys now, some of them, like Devin Singletary, for example, it's hard to tell who might compete with Devin Singletary for volume, but also drafters don't buy into him in the same way as they might have 5 years ago. So some of these more boring role-playing veterans that don't feel like they have a huge ceiling, particularly at running back, that's where I think this really started, have fallen in ADP relative to where they would have gone maybe a half decade ago. And I think we're starting to see that at wide receiver at the back end of the wide receiver window. And this whole point here, as it relates to like a Tyler Lockett or a Sutton, is I do think those guys are pretty clearly players that should be inside the wide receiver window. But traditionally, when we start to see veterans in this range, it's like, oh, those are the boring veterans that should be outside the wide receiver window. I think it's different this year. So my whole long answer on how I feel about Lockett is I think he's just a good value. I think he's a round 7 or round 8 pick that is now going at pick. I guess he's going in round 8-ish, or round 9-ish. I don't know. It's hard to do math, but I think he would typically have gone a round higher at least in a past season. And that it's the multi-year trend of drafters as a whole, of the market as a whole, that is pushing down profiles that do project for pretty stable routes and some actual real upside in terms of like, what could Cortland Sutton be if Bo Nix is a hit? What could Tyler Lockett be? What could Curtis Samuel be if he's the number 1? And his profile is decent enough. He was pretty good last year in Washington. He outperformed Jahan Dotson and was like right up there with Terry McLaurin. What if Curtis Samuel goes into Buffalo and winds up being the pretty clear number 1 for Josh Allen? I think I can make pretty good upside cases for all of them. Mike Williams a little bit trickier because I don't think he's ever going to be a huge volume player, but I think he's a perfect fit with Aaron Rodgers. And I don't think his profile this year, other than coming back from injury, looks that much different than the profile that people were willing to draft at the 4-5 turn for years for the Chargers. In fact, I think because of the quarterback fit, that like the efficiency and high touchdown rate play that he always was is, firmly intact. And now you have to pay, ADP of 108 prices. Maybe he's not the perfect example. He's the one that's sliding a little bit out of this group. But the other 3 I feel like are going to have the routes. They're going to have the target volume. It is that projection-based thinking that sometimes means a player doesn't have upside. But I do actually think these guys have the upside cases as well to be justifiably within the wide receiver window. But they're all older. They're all, super old. Cortland Sutton's not super old. For example, Tyler Lockett is 32. He's a little bit on the, getting long in the tooth. But they are guys that drafters, they're more boring names, don't want to take. They're not the big sexy names that everybody loves. And I think the reason we see them falling here, or what their significance of them is they are this transition group now as the wide receiver window starts to close. I'm taking them though, Sean. Like they are not outside my wide receiver window. I'm not taking as much of some of them. I've taken a decent amount of Lockett. I've taken a decent amount of Sutton. We were talking about him before the show. I was telling you, I mean, especially because he can slide a little. You mentioned to me, but especially my favorite thing is he's a part of a game that I love to stack. I love to have correlation in that. I love a lot of the pieces on the Bengals. I like Chase Brown. I like, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in the early rounds. And I like Denver plays as well. I'm playing Javonte Williams, and I like to play Bo Nix late as one of the cheapest ways to get what I think is pretty clear 17-week starting potential and some upside with it on the quarterback side. So as far as the week 17 matchups, I mean, that Denver Cincinnati game, I always seem to have pieces from in my lineups. Sutton's just an easy click to add to that because he does seem like he's going to be the clear number one. You've raised some concerns about him maybe getting traded, and that's something I have been considering. If that happens, that would be not ideal, obviously, for him. But this group here is really intriguing to me as a veteran group that I think in past years, I would argue, would be going higher, not lower. And as such, has traditionally always been a part of the wide receiver window, but feels like it's maybe not for our type of drafting.
The Seahawks situation is fascinating because the age is playing such a massive role in how we look at DK Metcalf versus Tyler Lockett, despite the fact that the Seahawks have just mildly recommitted to Lockett. You have Metcalf at wide receiver 22 in the middle of round 3 and Lockett at wide receiver 51 early in round 9. But I mean, the results from the last couple of years are interesting, right? If you told somebody those prices and then had them guess at stats, they would not tell you that both Lockett and Metcalf drew targets on 24% of their routes last season. Right? They would not tell you that Tyler Lockett led DK Metcalf in both touchdowns and yards per route in 2022. Now, one of the problems that you run into here is that as a receiver gets older, that most recent season becomes overwhelmingly important as opposed to a prior season as you look at them. But when you look at the last 2 seasons combined, I mean, these are 2 players with pretty similar numbers. Again, you think back to 2022, and on a per game basis, Tyler Lockett averaged 3 fantasy points over expectation per game. And DK Metcalf was at -1. I think that when you look at last season as an example, you tend to think about Metcalf being the explosive guy, the more efficient guy, the player who's going to do more with his targets. And it's certainly the case that he has a 0.5 to 0.7 edge over the last couple of years in weighted opportunity, right? He is going to get the deeper targets. Those targets are going to be a little bit more valuable. But that as recently as 2022, Lockett was the far more efficient player. And just last season, he matched him in targets per route. And again, we're talking about Tyler Lockett, who's been a good player over the long term. It's not something like that, came into be just for like one fleeting moment. We're talking about Tyler Lockett being a player who is very well established, and in the previous season when Geno Smith was actually good, right? 2022, he was in some ways the guy. Now, I certainly don't think these players should be going in the same spot because Metcalf is bigger and younger, and he does have that whopper advantage. And yet, when you're talking about 30 spots just at the wide receiver position, that part jumps out as, to me, it's so exploitable that even if you're very scared of older players, which I would put myself in that category. Blair Andrews has great research on the risk of a collapse. It's very intuitive that when you're that age, you have a big risk for collapse. That's not anything new to anybody. So I'm scared of that. And yet, again, the gap there, the only way that works for you as a DK Metcalf drafter is if Geno Smith is good And both Tyler Lockett and Jackson Smith and Jigba are bad. I mean, you have to have both of those things happen for that to work out and for DK Metcalf to be the play. And so, then I want to think through some other elements of this, one of which is that both Lockett and JSN ran a decent number of routes or drew a decent number of targets out of the slot. That doesn't necessarily mean they were lined up in the same way. Obviously, you've got a variety of things that you can do there. It's interesting to me because at Washington, all three of the big name receivers drew a lot of targets out of the slot last year. Now, part of that is because Jalen McMillan was injured and missed a decent chunk of time. In 2022, he drew 86 such targets, whereas Polk and Adunze were at 36 and 37. So you did have a specific guy who led by a wide margin, but you also had plenty of slot targets for those other players, including Adunze. You think back through how that could potentially work with someone like JSN, whom I mentioned before was actually much more productive in his peak season at Ohio State than Marvin Harrison was. But they were used very differently. And one of the things, obviously, with JSN is that he's a slot guy. So part of my question here would be, is the slot usage that we saw at Washington going to translate, not necessarily directly? I wouldn't expect any of this stuff to translate directly. I mean, Grubb is going to have to do a good job of modifying these offensive concepts to make them work at the NFL level. But is there a potential for those three players to play even more at the same time? One of the things that's kind of interesting when you consider that JSN kind of came on down the stretch in some ways last season, there's not actually a big difference in his route percentage over the first half of the year and the second half of the year. It's around 70% in both groupings, which certainly is low for what we hope that he's going to accomplish this season. If he's going to beat ADP, he's going to have to simply play more, and then he's going to have to be used more vertically. The other little note I would throw in here before tossing it back to you is that Geno has struggled with sack percentage in both of the last couple of years. It is an element where Grubb has talked up his athleticism, but I think we have to be aware of what that means for him. One of the things that happened between 2022 and 2023 is that the Seahawks collapsed in terms of pass blocking. And in 2022, they had a blown block rate of 3% on passing plays. That jumped up to like 4.6% last year. There were only a couple of teams that were even in that same category, right? You have teams like the Giants and the Titans, other teams that pass the ball extremely ineffectively in that group. So my concern would be that even though they add George Fant in free agency, even though they draft a guard with their third round pick, number 81 overall, that maybe we still just need a much better offensive line for Seattle to accomplish some of the things that they want to accomplish. But when we're looking at those pieces together, we've got the Geno Smith piece, we've got the three wide receiver piece, including, how close Lockett and Metcalf have been in a variety of ways. And then we have the Washington influence in terms of running the offense this year. And we've discussed that at decent length on the show, but I'm wondering how you see those three pieces now fitting together as we think about it through a fantasy football lens.
I think the way that you described Metcalf and Lockett and JSN, I mean, I agree with all of that stuff. And in terms of the Ryan Grubb effect, and I keep getting asked about like my thoughts on Twitter and elsewhere. And we've talked about it on the show a little bit, but because I watched the Huskies so closely on how the offense is going to run, and we've talked a little bit on the show just to catch people up quickly, but I've talked about it being, number one, hard to decouple him from Kalen DeBoer, who was the head coach and is an offensive-minded coach and is now at Alabama. And number two, that it's hard to know how much of it was like a scheme or was fit to personnel or those things, because one of the really fun traits about it was that it was very multiple and they used a lot of different formations and a lot of motion and a lot of misdirection. And that was cool. It's a very modern and innovative offense. And if Grubb, let's just start from the extreme optimism. Grubb was like a big part of all of that, and he's able to institute all of that at the NFL level. what I think you see is you get those guys on the field at the same time together, and you get them, the stuff like the slot percentages aren't relevant. You get them in a lot of different formations. You get them in bunch formations, stacked formations, standard traditional formations where Lockett probably kicks outside and JSN's in the slot, but all sorts of other things that force the defense to consider, different looks and what their assignments are from different alignments all throughout the game. And it's a lot of study, I think, probably to be prepared for that offense throughout the week. And then they're adding wrinkles to all of the plays and all those things. And then a lot of the time, what it is, I've talked about a couple different like specific plays that always stand out to me, but there's one where they did like a fake a play action to one side. They get the whole offensive line, like it's a run play to one side. They get the linebackers flowing one direction, then do a fake bubble screen to the other side. They get the linebackers then suddenly running back the other direction. And I've watched this play like 15 times. It was against Michigan State in 2022. And it's just so fun to watch the linebackers run all over the field and vacate the middle of the field. And then it's fakes to both sides perimeter. And then it's a tight end running right up the seam. And it's only like a 5-yard pass over the line of scrimmage, but the tight end catches it with nobody even on the screen with him. And he runs for like a 35-yard gain until a safety tracks him down. And we've seen that play a couple different other places. And in the, I don't know that UW was the first one to do it or popularize it, but in the years since, I've seen that play pop up, and it's a fun play to get the line blockers flowing to the perimeter and then just throw back to the middle of the field with a block and release. The point of that story there in this conversation is that there's a lot of plays like that and a lot of design like that where it felt like it was like a first read target. The ball's going to where the play was designed and schemed up almost. And this is one of the concerns I have for like a Jalen Polk, for example, where I'm not sure he's like a great separator or a great route runner as much as I think that the offense really helped scheme him into good looks and good opportunities where they seem the play design seems to consistently understand how to get players into the right spaces. And then it doesn't even have to be read out that much. And so like you were talking about the offensive line issues as well. UW's offensive line graded very, very well. To both of their tackles got drafted highly, and Michael Penix has a really low sack rate as a part of that. But I also think the scheme helped that. I do think that was a part of why Penix had the low sack rate. I think if you watched all the games, just a lot of the throws are quick, the ball's out, and the guy's wide open. And it's not like, oh, we just have a matchup we're going to exploit. It's like, well, yeah, you got Roma Dunze wide open that play, but next play you got Jalen Polk wide open, and now you got Jalen McMillan wide open, and now you got Jeremy Bernard, their fourth guy, or you got Devin Culp or Jack Westover, their two tight ends open. And it's like they've scripted the whole game to just confuse the defense and get whatever guy they want to get open at times. That's what it felt like at the peak, which is for me to say in terms of this question and what I expect. I don't know that he's going to be able to do all that at the NFL level. I actually think that he won't be able to do all of that at the NFL level, but it's exciting. I think there's reason for optimism. And I think there's plenty of reason to think that the best players will get on the field and will be schemed opportunities. Like everyone will get some opportunities. It would pull things flatter in terms of the target percentage. You started to talk about, obviously, Tyler Lockett's targets per out run being very similar to DK Metcalf's last year. I'm in complete agreement that the ADP gap is way too wide. I think Metcalf's a player that in terms of if you're scheming things up, you want to find it, intriguing ways to use him because of that size and speed and the skills that he brings. And I'm sure Grubb's got a lot of ideas for him. But if everything goes right for the Seahawks, I would think that it's a little bit more balanced overall. And I would think that the particular like target distributions and who wins and all of that stuff, it sort of comes down to like the key downs and when they really want to call somebody's number, what's the play that they really want to trust and who they can go to. And I always talk about this with the Dunze, is like whenever we had those spots, they always seem to go to a Dunze, and he always seemed to come up pretty big in those spots. And I don't necessarily know how that element of it will go for the Seahawks, but I do think like overall, because I think that could still be like a JSN if he's breaking out and making a lot of plays, like he might be the answer to that question, right? So I think the market thinks it's DK Metcalf clearly. You made a really strong case about obviously Tyler Lockett there as well. When we start talking about the JSN breakout scenario, that's an option. It'll be very interesting. As far as like the slot rate usage and all of that stuff, that's stuff that I've talked about. Like I don't anticipate being very predictive in terms of what they did at UW because it was so multiple. It was so, I think, unique and fit to the personnel that my expectation would be that they're fitting more stuff to the personnel at the NFL level, which means they're using the talent they have, all of it, including JSN, including Tyler Lockett. Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you broke down the actual players and how to play them makes a ton of sense. And Lockett, in terms of the age, risk, and those concerns, obviously that matters. But I think we want to be playing into him at this cost, at least for the reasons you said. Like it's worth considering the positive scenarios that, if the offense is exciting, if Geno Smith is good, I think he's going to definitely benefit in those ways.